September 19th, 1944. Dawn broke over the mist-shrouded fields near Arracourt, France. Oberleutnant Klaus Werner gripped the hatch rim of his Panther tank as his crew prepared for what German intelligence promised would be a swift counteroffensive. His tank, fresh from the factory with barely 2 weeks of crew training, represented Germany's technological answer to Allied armor. The glacis plate before him, 80mm of hardened steel sloped at 55 degrees, created an effective thickness approaching 140mm. German doctrine assured him this armor was impenetrable to American tank guns. Within hours, Werner would discover how catastrophically wrong that assessment had become. Hidden in their ammunition racks, American Sherman tanks carried something German intelligence had failed to anticipate. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. 6 rounds per tank. 6 M93 high-velocity armor-piercing rounds with tungsten carbide cores capable of transforming the tactical calculus of armored warfare. The psychological devastation these rounds would inflict on German tank crews would prove as destructive as their physical penetrating power, shattering the foundational belief that had sustained Panther crews through desperate fighting. The belief in invulnerability, the story of how specialized ammunition altered the balance of power in Western Europe, begins not with dramatic tank battles, but in the mundane world of metallurgy and industrial production. Where German engineers had created formidable armor protection, American industry would respond with a projectile that turned armor thickness into a dangerous illusion. In early 1944, American armored commanders faced a problem that threatened to undermine their entire operational doctrine. The Sherman tank, backbone of American mechanized forces, could not reliably defeat German Panthers from any angle that mattered. The Panther combined a powerful 75mm high-velocity gun with frontal armor protection that rendered American tank fire ineffective at combat ranges. American intelligence had catastrophically underestimated both the quantity and quality of Panthers deployed to Western Europe. By June 1944, when Allied forces stormed the Normandy beaches, 38% of German tanks in theater were Panthers. Not the handful predicted by pre-invasion estimates, but hundreds of these advanced medium tanks. Each one carried armor that standard American ammunition could not penetrate frontally at any practical distance. The 75mm M3 gun arming most Shermans in Normandy simply bounced rounds off Panther glacis plates. The Sherman crew would watch their shells ricochet harmlessly away while the Panther's gun, capable of destroying Shermans from beyond 2,000 meters, prepared its killing shot. Even the improved 76mm M1 gun, which began reaching American units in July 1944, struggled desperately against Panther armor. Using standard M62 armor-piercing capped rounds, the 76mm gun could penetrate 109mm of armor at 1,000 meters, measured at 0 degrees obliquity, sufficient against Panzer IVs and many German assault guns, completely inadequate against the Panther's sloped frontal armor, which remained effectively immune. The 76mm could theoretically penetrate the Panther's gun mantlet, but only at suicidal ranges under 100 meters. Distances at which the Panther's firepower advantages made engagement a death sentence for Sherman crews. The problem was not the gun barrel itself, but the ammunition it fired. The deployment of 76mm Shermans had been a saga of bureaucratic hesitation and delayed recognition of battlefield reality. The first M4 Shermans, mounting the 76mm gun, rolled off production lines in January 1944. These M4A 176 Shermans arrived in Britain on April 10, 1944. 130 tanks delivered specifically to prepare for the Normandy invasion. Yet, despite their availability, American commanders refused to deploy these improved tanks on D-Day. The reasons multiplied like excuses always do when disaster approaches unrecognized. Crews lacked adequate training time on the new weapon system. Logistical concerns about maintaining 2 different ammunition types complicated supply planning. Most critically, commanders believed the 75mm gun would prove adequate for expected opposition. This proved to be a catastrophic miscalculation rooted in dangerous assumptions about German armoured strength. By early July 1944, field reports from Normandy painted a grim picture that contradicted every pre-invasion assessment. On July 2nd, complaints about the 75mm gun's ineffectiveness against German armour reached General Dwight Eisenhower. His response, documented in multiple historical accounts, captured command-level frustration born of deadly miscalculation. "You mean our 76 won't knock these Panthers out? Why, I thought it was going to be the wonder gun of the war." The full quote, as recorded by witnesses present at the meeting, continued with language expressing Eisenhower's anger that ordnance had assured him the 76mm would handle anything the Germans deployed. Now, battlefield reality contradicted those assurances with the currency of American lives. A board convened on July 12, 1944, determined officially what tank crews already knew from bitter, deadly experience. Standard American weapons could not defeat Panthers frontally. General Omar Bradley immediately ordered the 76mm Shermans rushed from Britain to the front lines. On July 25, 1944, during Operation Cobra, 102 M4A 176 tanks made their combat debut in France. The initial engagement reports were sobering for crews who had hoped the new gun would solve their tactical problem. While the 76mm represented an improvement over the 75mm, it still struggled against Panther frontal armor at realistic combat ranges. Sherman crews quickly learned painful lessons about necessary tactics. They needed to maneuver for flank shots or target the Panther's gun mantlet at close range, neither option being tactically desirable when facing a tank that could destroy them from 2,000 meters away. The solution lay in metallurgy and physics rather than barrel length or propellant charge. By July 1944, American ordnance engineers had developed the T4 round, later standardized as the M93 HVAP. High-velocity armor-piercing ammunition represented a fundamental departure from conventional armor-piercing projectile design born of necessity and industrial capacity. The projectile consisted of a tungsten carbide core, one of the hardest materials available to wartime industry, surrounded by a lightweight aluminum body and ballistic windshield. This design concentrated the projectile's kinetic energy into a smaller, denser penetrator while reducing overall projectile weight. The physics were unforgiving in their mathematical precision. Less weight meant higher velocity. Higher velocity meant greater kinetic energy delivery at the point of impact. The result was dramatic by the standards of incremental weapons improvement. The M93 round achieved a muzzle velocity of 1,036 meters per second compared to 792 meters per second for the standard M62 round. This 244 meters per second velocity increase translated directly into penetrating power through the brutal arithmetic of kinetic energy. At 1,000 yards, approximately 914 meters, the HVAP round could penetrate 160 millimeters of armor measured at 10 degrees, obliquity. According to official War Department testing data conducted in August 1944 against the Panther's gun mantlet with its curved 100mm thick cast steel on early Ausführung D and A variants, later increased to 120mm on the Ausführung G. This meant reliable penetration at ranges up to 1,000 meters instead of point-blank distance. The mantlet suddenly became a viable target for Sherman crews who had previously been forced to attempt desperate flank attacks or shameful retreat. The psychological impact of possessing a weapon that could hurt Panthers would prove as important as the weapon's actual capabilities. Morale is built on the belief that fighting back is possible, but the development of HVAP represented only half the solution to American armored forces' tactical problem. Production was another matter entirely, constrained by global resource availability and strategic material scarcity. The T4 round depended on tungsten carbide, a strategic material imported primarily from China, which produced 36% of global tungsten supply before the war disrupted traditional trade networks. Tungsten was critical to numerous war industries fighting for allocation from desperately limited supplies. Machine tools required tungsten carbide cutting edges. Armor-piercing ammunition for multiple calibers consumed tungsten. Armor plate hardening processes used tungsten. Various industrial processes demanded tungsten, all competing for allocation from supplies that could never satisfy total demand. American tungsten demand for HVAP ammunition alone consumed hundreds of metric tons annually from an allocation system strained to breaking. Each 76mm HVAP round contained approximately 0.88 kilograms of tungsten carbide, meaning a Sherman carrying 6 rounds required nearly 5 kilograms of this scarce strategic material. Multiply by thousands of tanks, and the resource constraint became brutally apparent. China produced approximately 10,000 metric tons of tungsten concentrates in 1944, but this supply had to serve all Allied needs across all applications globally. The United States supplemented Chinese imports with domestic production from limited deposits in Colorado, Nevada, and California, but total availability remained severely constrained throughout the war. Germany's tungsten position was far worse, demonstrating how resource access shaped military capability as surely as engineering excellence. Swedish imports declined sharply as the war turned against the Reich and neutral Sweden calculated new political alignments. German domestic tungsten production remained minimal throughout the conflict. By 1945, German factories desperately hoarded tungsten for machine tools needed for aircraft engine production, while Panther crews received only standard ammunition without specialized tungsten core rounds. The United States Ordnance Department had been testing HVAP projectiles since spring 1942, but production at meaningful scale did not begin until after the Normandy landings revealed the extent of the Panther problem to commanders who had previously dismissed field reports. In July 1944, production of 3-inch HVAP rounds for tank destroyers reached 1,000 rounds total. August saw 1,000 rounds of 76mm HVAP produced. September yielded another 1,076mm rounds. Not until November 1944 did monthly production reach 5,000 rounds for the 76mm, ramping to 7,000 rounds per month by January 1945. By March 1945, approximately 33,000 rounds of 76mm HVAP ammunition had been produced, representing significant industrial effort but still a fraction of what operational requirements demanded. By February 1945, the average 76mm Sherman in Europe had received a total of 5 HVAP rounds. 5 rounds to face an enemy deploying Panthers as standard equipment in Panzer divisions. A Sherman company with 17 tanks would possess 85 HVAP rounds total, while facing German units that might field 30 or more Panthers in a single engagement. The first HVAP rounds reached the European theatre in August 1944, but their arrival was overshadowed by broader tactical problems plaguing American armored operations. The Normandy hedgerows had forced American armor into close-quarters combat, where superior German guns could ambush Sherman columns from prepared positions. Tank crews faced an enemy who had learned to position Panther's hull down, exposing only the heavily armored turret while keeping the more vulnerable hull hidden behind terrain. German tactical doctrine emphasized first-shot capability, with Panthers waiting in carefully prepared positions, allowing Sherman columns to approach before opening fire from ranges where American return fire was ineffective even with improved ammunition. The psychological impact on American tank crews was severe and cumulative. Crews nicknamed the Sherman the Ronson lighter, claiming it lit on fire every time someone struck it. While post-war analysis showed this reputation was significantly exaggerated by survivor bias and selective memory, the perception shaped battlefield behavior in measurable ways. Tank commanders who spotted Panthers often chose to call for artillery or air support rather than engage directly, ceding tactical initiative to an enemy who could be defeated with proper ammunition and aggressive tactics. The arrival of HVAP rounds began changing this tactical calculus, but slowly, hampered by the desperate scarcity of the ammunition and the lack of systematic training on its capabilities and limitations. Crews needed to understand effective engagement, ranges, optimal target points, and the ammunition's significant limitations against heavily sloped armor at oblique angles. The first widespread combat test of HVAP ammunition came not in Normandy's claustrophobic hedgerows, but in the open country of Lorraine, where American armored divisions had broken out into terrain that paradoxically favored German defensive tactics. September 1944 found Lieutenant General George Patton's Third Army, deep in France, racing toward the German border, with logistics stretched to breaking point by the speed of their advance. The 4th Armored Division, one of the most effective American armored formations in Europe, had advanced aggressively beyond sustainable supply lines, seizing a bridgehead over the Moselle River near Arracourt. German High Command recognized the strategic threat immediately. If Patton's armor reached the Rhine and crossed into Germany proper, the industrial heart of the Reich would be exposed to mechanized exploitation. General Hasso von Manteuffel's 5th Panzer Army received orders to counterattack, destroy the American bridgehead, and push back Patton's advance before it could threaten German territory. The German force assembled for this counterattack included 2 newly formed Panzer brigades, the 111th and 113th, equipped primarily with Panther tanks fresh from German factories and crewed by soldiers with minimal training. On paper, the German advantage appeared overwhelming to planners examining unit compositions and equipment lists. The 2 brigades together fielded approximately 150 tanks against Combat Command A of the 4th Armored Division, which possessed roughly 50 Sherman tanks. The 113th Panzer Brigade alone entered battle with approximately 90 tanks and assault guns in both battalions combined, including 42 Panthers and 40 Panzer IVs. German planners anticipated rapid victory based on superior equipment and local numerical superiority. The Panther's technical advantages should compensate for any American advantages in logistics or air support. They were fundamentally, catastrophically mistaken in ways that would cost hundreds of German tank crews their lives and their machines. The Battle of Arracourt, fought over 11 days from September 18th to 29th, would become the largest tank engagement fought by American forces until the Battle of the Bulge. More importantly, it would demonstrate that American tank crews, properly trained and equipped with specialized ammunition, could defeat technically superior German armor through superior tactics, combined arms coordination, and judicious use of high-velocity armor-piercing ammunition. The morning of September 19th began with thick fog blanketing the rolling terrain around Arracourt, reducing visibility to dozens of meters rather than the kilometers German doctrine required for effective Panther employment. German reconnaissance was limited by lack of proper scouting units. The Panzer brigades, lacking adequate reconnaissance elements, advanced blindly into terrain held by American forces who knew the ground intimately and had established defensive positions overnight. At approximately 8 o'clock in the morning, elements of the 113th Panzer Brigade penetrated American outposts east and south of Arracourt. The German tanks, factory-new Panthers with inexperienced crews who had trained together for mere weeks, moved forward in column formation. A tactical error that veteran American tankers immediately recognized and exploited with practiced efficiency. Captain Kenneth Lamison's C Company, 37th Tank Battalion, held positions along key approaches to Arracourt. His Sherman crews had been briefed on the HVAP rounds in their ammunition racks. 6 rounds per tank. The briefing had emphasized careful employment. Use them wisely against Panther turrets or mantlets at ranges where velocity remained sufficient for penetration. Don't waste them on impossible shots against glacis plates. The fog that hindered German reconnaissance now worked decisively in favor of American defenders who knew exactly where enemy approaches must come. A section of Lamison's Shermans occupied positions south of the village when the first Panther materialized from the mist, barely 75 meters away. At this range, the Panther's superior long-range gunnery capability meant nothing. Combat was reduced to who could fire first and hit accurately under pressure. The American gunner fired instantly with the reflexes of training and experience. The HVAP round, traveling at over 1,000 meters per second, struck the Panther's gun mantlet with devastating effect. The tungsten carbide core punched through the curved cast steel, and detonated the ammunition stored directly beneath the gun breech. The Panther exploded, its turret lifting slightly from the force of the secondary detonation before crashing back down on the burning hull. Two more Panthers emerged from the fog in quick succession, their commanders unable to see the destroyed lead tank until too late. Both were destroyed within seconds by Sherman gunners who had practiced precisely this engagement scenario. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The Panther crews had no time to effectively return fire in the limited visibility that negated all their carefully engineered advantages. The remaining German tanks turned away, their crews shocked by the sudden loss of 3 Panthers to what they had been assured were inferior American tanks incapable of frontal penetration. The psychological impact on German tank commanders was immediate and devastating. The foundational assumption of Panther invulnerability had just been shattered by battlefield reality. Throughout the morning of September 19th, similar engagements erupted across the Arracourt sector as German columns blundered into American defensive positions. American tanks, using the fog as concealment, engaged Panthers at ranges where HVAP rounds were most effective. The German tactical deployment proved disastrous, revealing how inexperience and inadequate training negated technical superiority. Advancing in column without proper reconnaissance, Panther crews repeatedly exposed their thinner side armor to American flanking fire. Near Arracourt's command post, a platoon of M18 Hellcat tank destroyers, also equipped with 76mm guns and HVAP ammunition, engaged German armor at close range with devastating effectiveness. The fast-moving tank destroyers proved remarkably lethal in close-range fog-shrouded combat. By noon, as the fog lifted, American forward artillery observers could coordinate fire with defending tank companies, calling in concentrations that disrupted German formations and prevented coordinated attacks. P-47 Thunderbolt fighter bombers of the 405th Fighter Group arrived overhead, diving through gaps in the clouds to strike German armor with rockets and machine guns. The combination of American tactical advantages became brutally clear to German survivors. While the Panther possessed superior armor and firepower as an individual weapon system examined in isolation, American forces employed combined arms tactics as standard operational doctrine. German tanks advanced without adequate artillery support, without air cover, without infantry to clear American defensive positions. American forces coordinated armor with artillery, air power, infantry, and tank destroyers in an integrated system that overwhelmed German technical advantages through systematic combined arms application. When Panthers encountered these prepared defenses, they were destroyed piecemeal, despite their superior individual capabilities. The HVAP ammunition did not make Sherman tanks equal to Panthers in technical specifications measured on testing ranges. Warfare is not conducted according to technical specifications alone. Tanks are destroyed by crews who exploit vulnerabilities under actual combat conditions. The Panther's gun mantlet, necessary to allow the 75mm gun to elevate and traverse, created a weak point that could not be eliminated by design. The junction between turret and hull, the side armor, the engine deck, all represented targets that HVAP-equipped Shermans could now engage successfully at combat ranges that previously had been suicidal to attempt. More devastating to German morale was the psychological impact of discovering their armor was no longer providing the invulnerability doctrine promised. Panther crews had been trained explicitly to believe their tanks could not be penetrated frontally by American fire. Intelligence briefings emphasized the Sherman's inadequate firepower as established fact. Crews were told repeatedly that as long as they kept the front toward the enemy, they were safe behind impenetrable armor. The first Panther commanders to watch Sherman rounds punch through their mantlets and detonate ready ammunition learned otherwise in the final seconds of their lives. Survivors of such encounters carried that knowledge back to their units, spreading awareness that American tanks now possessed ammunition capable of defeating Panthers frontally. This information spread through German armored units with the speed of terrifying news always travels. By the afternoon of September 19th, German tank commanders were reporting to headquarters that American Shermans possessed new, more powerful ammunition. The reports were confused and contradictory, as battlefield intelligence always becomes under stress. Some claimed the Americans had secretly deployed tank destroyers with 90mm guns. Others suggested the British had provided 17-pounder Firefly tanks to American units in violation of equipment allocation agreements. The truth that American industry had developed specialized ammunition that partially negated the Panther's armor advantage was more troubling to German planners than any of these speculative theories. It meant that American industrial capacity could respond to tactical problems faster than German industry could counter them. It meant the material balance was shifting inexorably against Germany. The fighting continued through September 22 when the major German offensive efforts finally stalled completely. American forces had destroyed or disabled approximately 86 German tanks and assault guns. American losses stood at 25 Sherman tanks and 7 tank destroyers. The kill ratio heavily favored the Americans despite their acknowledged technical disadvantage in individual tank performance. The Battle of Arracourt represented not just a tactical victory but a psychological watershed in Western Front armored combat. American tank crews learned conclusively that they could defeat Panthers without waiting for specialized tank destroyers or overwhelming air support. German crews lost the psychological security of believing in absolute frontal invulnerability that had sustained them through desperate fighting. The German perspective on Arracourt was one of confusion and bitter recrimination flowing through after-action reports. The 113th Panzer Brigade, which had entered battle with approximately 90 tanks and assault guns, could muster fewer than 20 operational vehicles by September 29. German after-action reports struggled to explain the defeat in terms that preserved institutional assumptions. The technical superiority of the Panther was undeniable on paper, confirmed by engineering specifications and testing data. How had inexperienced crews in newly produced tanks been defeated so comprehensively by supposedly inferior American equipment? The answers lay partly in training and experience differential. The Panzer Brigade crews had minimal training, often arriving at the front with only weeks of instruction on their vehicles. American tank crews in the 4th Armored Division were veterans who had fought across France since the Normandy breakout, understood combined arms warfare through hard-won experience, and had learned to read terrain for tactical advantage. But training and experience alone did not fully explain Panther losses, particularly the penetrations that should not have been possible with standard American ammunition, according to German technical assessments. German intelligence officers examining destroyed Panthers found entry holes smaller than expected from standard 76mm rounds, suggesting a sub-caliber projectile with higher density penetrator. Examination of unexploded rounds recovered near disabled tanks revealed the truth that explained impossible penetrations. The Americans had deployed tungsten carbide ammunition. This discovery had profound strategic implications that extended far beyond immediate tactical concerns. Germany itself had developed similar ammunition, the Panzer Granit 40, which used tungsten cores to improve penetration against heavily armored Soviet tanks. But German tungsten supplies were critically limited by late 1944, with production focused on machine tools rather than ammunition. If Americans could field specialized tungsten carbide ammunition in quantities sufficient to distribute to frontline tank units rather than hoarding it for specialist units, it demonstrated industrial capacity and resource access that Germany could not match. Not only were American tanks more numerous and better supported logistically, but they were now equipped with ammunition that partially negated Germany's carefully engineered technical advantages in armor protection. The impact of HVAP ammunition extended beyond immediate tactical results at Arracourt into the realm of unit morale and battlefield psychology. As word spread through American armored units that the new ammunition could defeat Panthers under favorable circumstances, tank crews became measurably more willing to engage German armor directly rather than calling for support. The psychological paralysis that had affected some units during the difficult Normandy fighting began to dissipate as confidence replaced resignation. Crews still respected the Panther's capabilities, maintaining appropriate tactical caution, but no longer felt helpless against it. This shift in morale proved crucial for subsequent operations as the front moved toward Germany. A crew that believes it can fight will engage aggressively, seeking advantageous positions and taking calculated risks that create opportunities. A crew that believes it is outmatched will hesitate, ceding initiative to the enemy and creating self-fulfilling prophecies of defeat. HVAP ammunition, though in critically short supply throughout the war, provided American tankers with a weapon that allowed them to fight Panthers on more equal terms psychologically. Even crews that had never personally fired an HVAP round benefited psychologically from knowing the ammunition existed and might be available when most desperately needed. The mere existence of the capability influenced tactical decision-making at the crew and platoon level. Commanders were forced to make difficult prioritization decisions, with the desperately limited HVAP supply that never satisfied demand. Tank destroyers, whose mission focused specifically on anti-tank combat, received preferential allocation in most cases. Sherman tanks, with their dual role of supporting infantry and engaging armor, often received fewer rounds despite encountering enemy tanks more frequently in practice. This created operational tension between tactical needs and supply realities that allocation systems struggled to resolve effectively. The allocation system, managed at multiple command levels from army down to battalion, resulted in inevitable inefficiencies. Some units received more HVAP than they could immediately use, while others exhausted their supply within days and received no resupply despite urgent requests. When German forces launched their surprise offensive in the Ardennes in December 1944, American tank units faced renewed intense pressure from concentrated German armor. The Battle of the Bulge saw hundreds of Panthers and Tiger tanks deployed in winter conditions that favored defensive fighting and limited Allied air superiority due to poor weather grounding aircraft. American Sherman crews relied heavily on their scarce HVAP ammunition to engage German heavy armor during the desperate defensive fighting. The shortage became critical within days of heavy combat. Some units exhausted their HVAP supply completely and found resupply requests going unfulfilled as logistical networks struggled to deliver ammunition through snow-blocked roads disrupted by German advances. Yet, even in the difficult fighting of the Ardennes, American forces demonstrated that tactical skill and combined arms coordination could compensate for technical disadvantage when properly applied. Tank crews coordinated closely with infantry, using bazooka teams to disable Panthers from close range, while Shermans provided covering fire and engaged targets of opportunity. Artillery forward, observers called in time on target missions that damaged optics, disabled tracks, and killed exposed crew members, even when shells could not penetrate armor directly. Air support, when weather finally permitted in late December and early January, proved devastatingly effective against German armor concentrated on approach roads without cover. The Battle of the Bulge ended with German armored forces shattered, having lost hundreds of irreplaceable tanks and experienced crews in an offensive that failed to reach its objectives or alter strategic realities. By early 1945, the strategic picture had shifted decisively and irreversibly in Allied favor on all fronts. American and British forces were preparing to cross the Rhine and invade Germany proper. Soviet armies were advancing from the east, having shattered German defensive lines in massive winter offensives that destroyed entire army groups. Germany's industrial capacity was collapsing under combined strategic bombing, loss of territory containing critical resources and manufacturing facilities, and severe shortages of raw materials, including fuel and tungsten. Panther production, which had reached 3,900 units in 1944, fell sharply in early 1945 as factories were bombed, transportation networks disrupted, and raw materials became unavailable. Even when Panthers were produced, fuel shortages often kept them immobile. German tank units in the final months frequently abandoned tanks not because of combat damage, but because they had no fuel to operate them. The technical limitations of HVAP, while less publicized than its successes, deserve examination for historical completeness and understanding of weapons capabilities. The tungsten carbide core, while excellent at penetrating armor when conditions were favorable, was inherently brittle due to material properties. below certain impact velocities, approximately 2,300 to 2,500 feet per second, the core could shatter on contact rather than penetrating. This meant that HVAP effectiveness declined significantly at longer ranges, where projectile velocity had decreased below critical thresholds. The effective range against Panther mantlets was approximately 1,000 meters maximum. Beyond this distance, the probability of the core shattering on impact increased substantially, rendering the expensive specialized ammunition no more effective than standard rounds. American tankers learned these limitations through combat experience, sometimes tragically through failed engagements that cost lives and tanks. Crews that fired HVAP at Panthers beyond effective range wasted scarce ammunition and often provoked return fire from German guns that remained effective at much longer ranges than American weapons. Training on proper HVAP employment was often minimal or non-existent, as the ammunition arrived at frontline units faster than training materials could be developed and distributed through command channels. Many crews learned effective employment techniques through trial and error under actual combat conditions, an expensive education measured in casualties. The post-war analysis of HVAP ammunition revealed both its successes and limitations through careful examination of combat results. Against the Panther's gun mantlet at ranges up to 1,000 meters, HVAP was highly effective when hits were achieved, reliably penetrating and often causing catastrophic secondary explosions of ammunition. Against the glacis plate, results were poor, except at very close ranges and favorable angles. The extreme slope meant that tungsten carbide rounds traveling at high velocity often ricocheted or shattered on impact rather than penetrating. This meant Sherman crews still needed to maneuver for advantageous shot angles, flanking Panthers when tactically possible. The ammunition did not make Sherman tanks technical equals to Panthers measured by specifications, but it gave American crews a fighting chance in engagements where previously they had little hope of frontal penetration. The Korean War, beginning in June 1950, provided another combat test of HVAP effectiveness under very different conditions. American Sherman tanks, now primarily the M4A3E8 variant armed with 76mm guns, faced Soviet-built T-34, 85 tanks in North Korean and later Chinese service throughout the conflict. Unlike the situation in Europe where HVAP had been critically scarce, by 1950 tungsten supplies were no longer constrained by competing wartime demands, and substantial stocks of ammunition were readily available. American tank crews in Korea found that HVAP rounds easily penetrated T-34, 85 armor at normal combat ranges without difficulty. The T-34, 85, while capable in many respects, possessed armor protection significantly inferior to the Panther. Its 90mm thick turret front and 45mm thick glacis plate could not resist tungsten carbide projectiles fired at high velocity from 76mm guns. American Shermans in Korea achieved remarkably favorable exchange ratios against communist armor, due partly to superior crew training, but also significantly to the plentiful availability of HVAP ammunition. The vindication of the 76mm Sherman in Korea was bittersweet for veterans of European combat who had fought with inadequate ammunition supplies. The ammunition that could have been more widely employed in Europe proved devastatingly effective in Asia, when supply constraints no longer limited employment, and tanks faced less formidable armor protection. The German perspective on American HVAP ammunition, gathered from post-war interrogations and examination of captured documents, revealed grudging professional respect mixed with deep frustration over industrial disparities. German ordnance officers recognized that American industry had solved the tungsten core ammunition problem more successfully than German manufacturers, despite Germany having pioneered the underlying technology. While Germany had developed tungsten carbide ammunition with the Panzer Granate 40 series, production limitations meant these rounds were never available in sufficient quantities for widespread use. American production of HVAP, though also limited by tungsten scarcity, still exceeded German capability substantially by late 1944 when it mattered most. German tank crews interviewed after the war frequently mentioned American ammunition improvements as a significant factor that complicated their tactical situation and influenced battlefield outcomes. The knowledge that Sherman tanks could penetrate Panther mantlets at combat ranges meant German crews could not simply rely on frontal armor for protection as doctrine assumed. This forced more cautious tactics, slower advances, and greater reliance on defensive positions that ceded initiative to American forces. Defensive warfare allowed Americans to employ combined arms tactics that negated German advantages in individual tank performance. The psychological impact of losing armor in vulnerability contributed to the increasingly defensive mindset that characterized German armored operations in 1945. September 19th, 1944, when First Lieutenant Merwin Marston's Sherman crews first engaged Panthers with HVAP ammunition at Arracourt, marked a genuine turning point in the psychological balance of armored warfare on the Western Front. German crews who had fought confidently behind their armor learned that American tanks could pose a serious frontal threat under proper conditions. American crews who had felt outmatched gained meaningful confidence from knowing they possessed ammunition that could defeat Panthers under favorable circumstances. This shift in tactical psychology, enabled by tungsten carbide ammunition produced in American factories from strategic materials shipped across the Pacific, influenced every subsequent armored engagement of the European War. HVAP ammunition, though never available in desired quantities that satisfied operational requirements, provided enough improved capability to transform American tank crews from uncertain defenders into confident attackers willing to engage German armor directly. The crews who fired those first HVAP rounds in combat, watching tungsten cores punch through armor that had seemed invincible, demonstrated that industrial capacity and material science applied intelligently to urgent tactical problems could overcome seemingly insurmountable technical disadvantages. The Panther tank remained superior to the Sherman in almost every measurable technical specification until war's end. But technical specifications do not determine battlefield outcomes when human factors, training quality, logistical support, combined arms coordination, and industrial capacity enter the equation. German tankers faced 76mm HVAP rounds and realized their armor was no longer enough to guarantee survival or victory. That realization, spreading through German armored units in autumn 1944, contributed to the psychological erosion that preceded military collapse. When soldiers lose faith in their equipment's ability to protect them, when assumptions of superiority shatter against battlefield reality, morale deteriorates regardless of courage or training. American industry had found a way to crack the Panther's psychological armor even more effectively than its physical protection. The fundamental lesson learned at considerable cost on battlefields across Europe remains directly relevant for military planners facing technological challenges of modern warfare. Superior technology matters, providing measurable advantages in specific engagements. But sustained military success requires industrial capacity to produce that technology in meaningful quantities, logistical systems to deliver it to frontline units, and training infrastructure to ensure effective employment. German engineering excellence created the Panther, a tank superior in most technical respects to anything American factories produced during the war. But American industrial capacity produced Sherman tanks by the thousands, supported them with unlimited ammunition and fuel, and continually improved their capabilities through iterative development like HVAP ammunition. The tungsten carbide core represented a relatively simple solution to a complex problem. Instead of redesigning the entire tank or developing a completely new gun, American engineers modified the ammunition to maximize penetration with existing weapons systems. This incremental improvement approach, characteristic of American military procurement throughout the war, contrasted sharply with German tendency toward revolutionary designs that strained production capacity. German tank development pursued technical perfection at the expense of production, efficiency, and operational availability. The Panther required extensive manufacturing infrastructure, skilled labor, and specialized materials. Production never approached numbers that could replace battlefield losses and equip new formations simultaneously. By contrast, Sherman production reached industrial scales that ensured numerical superiority, despite individual technical inferiority. The story of HVAP ammunition illuminates broader patterns of industrial warfare in the 20th century. Victory went not to the side with the best individual weapons, but to the side that could produce good enough weapons in overwhelming quantities, support them logistically, and employ them effectively through superior tactics and training. German tankers discovered this truth, watching American Shermans knock out their supposedly invulnerable Panthers. The psychological dimension of the HVAP story deserves final emphasis. Military effectiveness depends heavily on soldier confidence in their equipment and doctrine. German tank crews in early 1944 possessed justified confidence in Panther armor protection. This confidence enabled aggressive tactics and sustained morale through difficult fighting. When HVAP ammunition shattered that confidence, tactical effectiveness declined measurably even when Panthers faced standard ammunition. The mere knowledge that American tanks might possess HVAP rounds changed German tactical calculations. Commanders positioned tanks more defensively, engaged at longer ranges when possible, and generally fought more cautiously. This psychological effect multiplied the tactical impact of relatively scarce ammunition far beyond the number of rounds actually fired in combat. American crews experienced the inverse psychological trajectory. Initial encounters with Panthers created fear and reluctance to engage. The arrival of HVAP ammunition, even in inadequate quantities, restored confidence and enabled more aggressive tactics. Crews who knew they possessed some capability to hurt Panthers fought more effectively even when using standard ammunition, because the psychological paralysis of helplessness had been lifted. Modern military ammunition development still follows principles established by HVAP development. Current armor-piercing, fin-stabilized discarding sabot rounds use depleted uranium or tungsten alloy penetrators, materials chosen for the same density and hardness properties that made tungsten carbide effective in World War II. The underlying physics remain constant across 8 decades of development. Concentrate maximum kinetic energy into the smallest possible contact area, using the densest available materials traveling at the highest achievable velocity. This principle, proven effective at Arracourt in September 1944, governs anti-armor ammunition design in contemporary military forces worldwide. The Battle of Arracourt and the HVAP ammunition that influenced its outcome represent a case study in how wars are won, not through superior technology alone, but through the ability to identify problems, develop solutions, produce them in meaningful quantities, and employ them effectively. German tankers who faced 76mm HVAP rounds learned this lesson in the most direct and deadly way possible. Their technically superior Panthers, crewed by increasingly desperate soldiers and starved of fuel and ammunition, could not overcome American advantages in industrial production, logistical support, tactical flexibility, and combined arms coordination. The tungsten carbide core punching through their mantlets was merely the physical manifestation of deeper industrial and organizational superiority that determined the war's outcome. The men who fought at Arracourt on both sides demonstrated courage and tactical skill. German Panzer crews attacked despite being outnumbered and poorly supported. American tank crews held defensive positions against technically superior enemies and fought with intelligence and coordination. But individual courage and skill operated within frameworks determined by industrial capacity and resource availability. American industry could replace every Sherman lost at Arracourt within days. German industry could not replace the Panthers destroyed there in any reasonable time frame. American logistics could deliver unlimited ammunition, fuel, and spare parts. German logistics struggled to provide basic supplies. These disparities, more than any individual engagement, determined the war's outcome. The HVAP round stands as a monument to American industrial problem-solving applied to military necessity. Engineers identified the problem, developed a solution using available materials and existing weapons systems, and industry scaled production to meaningful levels, despite resource constraints. The solution was not perfect, but it was adequate and available when needed. German tankers faced 76mm HVAP rounds and realized their armor was no longer enough. That realization spread through German armored forces in autumn 1944, contributing to the psychological erosion that preceded military collapse. When soldiers lose faith in their equipment's ability to protect them, morale deteriorates regardless of courage or dedication. The tungsten carbide core that American industry produced by the thousands represented more than improved ammunition. It represented the arsenal of democracy translating industrial capacity into military power, solving tactical problems through engineering and production rather than revolutionary redesign. This approach, characteristic of American military development throughout the war, proved decisively effective despite lacking the technical elegance German engineers prized. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.